to him at the end of his presentation. Now I'll hand over to Luke to start his presentation. Many thanks.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the slight technical snafu, and thank you, Sarah, and for the Oxford BRC for inviting me to talk here. So today I'm going to be talking about irritable bowel syndrome, as Sarah's introduced. I've got a slight change to the talk as it was titled as it was presented. I realised that I didn't realise that I didn't include genetics in my title, and genetics is going to be a particular focus of this talk. So as we've heard, irritable bowel syndrome is a relatively common disease of the digestive system. It's diagnosed by abdominal pain. It involves these abnormal contractions of the intestine that can be painful or uncomfortable. There is a sort of a technical definition that we use for this study, which is called the Rome 3 definition of IBS. That is that you're defined as having IBS or diagnosed as having IBS if you suffer from abdominal pain or discomfort at least 3 times a month. So, at least 3 times a month, and it's been going on for at least 3 months, and it's associated with at least 2 of the following criteria: that your symptoms improve with defecation. So if you go to the toilet, your symptoms improve, or the onset of your symptoms is associated with the change of your frequency of stool, so associated with going to the toilet more or less often, or that the onset is associated with the change in form of your stool. I won't go into detail on that, but I'm sure you can see what that means. So that's sort of what the symptoms of IBS are. IBS is also, to some extent, a diagnosis of exclusion. By that we mean you're defined as having IBS if you have the following symptoms and doctors can't find another reason to explain it, another disease that could explain it. So, for example, you may have these kind of symptoms because you have celiac disease or gluten intolerance, or because you have inflammatory bowel disease or inflammation in the intestine, or because you have a cancer of the colon. So those are things that could cause these symptoms. And IBS is if you have these symptoms, but it cannot be explained by another disease. So there's a number of our group studies various questions about IBS, some of the kind of questions we sort of have and we set out to answer with the study. So one is a sort of simple question of how common is IBS in the UK population, and related to that, how do we figure this out? How do we figure out how common IBS? Mostly because this can be a little bit of a difficult thing to answer, because most IBS sufferers don't have a doctor's diagnosis. Many don't even know that they have it. They know that they have symptoms, but they don't know that it's called IBS or what it is. Another question is sort of, is IBS genetic, which is a bit of a strange thing to say. There isn't, in one sense, IBS is not genetic. There is not a gene for IBS. People don't have IBS because they have some mutation in their DNA that makes them have the disease. That's not the case. But your DNA does play a role in the disease, and in particular, the DNA that you inherit from your parents can put you at higher or lower risk. And we really like to know how strong the effect this is, and if this effect, the extent to which this effect exists, what genes are actually involved, what parts of the DNA are involved. And the final thing that we've kind of been focusing on increasingly is how does IBS relate to mental health? So there's a kind of question: is IBS all in your head, which is a question people often ask when we say we study IBS in mental health. So no, IBS is definitely not all in your head. It is definitely a disease of the gut. It manifests as problems with digestion and discomfort around digestion. But it is the case that people that have IBS are more likely than people that have healthy digestion to suffer from a range of mental health issues. And there's a general question about where does this relationship come from? Why is IBS and mental health, or more generally digestive health and mental health, so closely related? So how do we go about studying IBS and studying IBS genetics? For genetic studies, we really need very large sample sizes. So we need lots of participants to take part in our research, ideally tens of thousands of individuals or more. Starting up a big study like that is very expensive, it's very difficult, it's very time consuming. So we sort of cheated here, or we collaborated with an existing study, a general health study that had been studying lots of different elements of health in order to identify IBS patients within their population. And that allows us to look in an existing population without having to recruit a load of new people. We work with a project called the UK BioBank, which is a very large, nearly UK-wide cohort. I say nearly, it includes England, Wales, and Scotland. It doesn't include recruitment in Northern Ireland, but in total, they've recruited more than 500,000 people. These are mostly people that were slightly older during recruitment. Most of the people now are in their 50s or 60s or older. And as well as recruiting them into the study, they collected a huge amount of data on these individuals over a long period of time. Questions on their lifestyle, their medical history, their genetics, and quite a lot of data collected from their DNA, which was very helpful for us. But also medical records, hospital records, death certificates when people died. Not many people have died so far, but we have information for when people have died. So that gives us a sort of this big platform to study already. And the other thing that the UK Biobank does, which is really useful, is these web-based questionnaires. So these are questionnaires that participants can take online. And we worked with the UK Biobank to design this digestive health survey, or the digestive health questionnaire, which is an online questionnaire that was designed by a range of gastroenterologists and geneticists and epidemiologists around the UK, and it asks a number of questions. And so, participants in this study log on to the website and they get asked questions like this. It comes up on the screen of, in the last 3 months, how often did you have hard or lumpy stools? And they answer somewhere between, never to always. After giving this survey, we invited all 500,000 of the UK Biobank participants to take it, and nearly 175,000 people responded, and still more are coming in over time. So this is a huge amount of people. This is far larger than we'll be able to get through any other way, and is probably, we think, the largest general survey of digestive health that's been done. It's certainly much larger than we could have done without this collaboration. So what did we learn? Sort of an outline. Let's just give you some statistics about this population. So of the people that we looked at that took the survey, about 1 in 7 had IBS symptoms at any given time. That's IBS symptoms, and based on their medical records, we couldn't find any other explanation for it. Only about 1/3 of those had actually been diagnosed with IBS by a doctor. So there's quite a large number of people here that have IBS that hasn't been previously diagnosed. Sex ratio, as is often the case with IBS, is biased somewhat towards women, so it's 30-70 male to female. Most of these cases, as well as measuring whether they had IBS based on these Rome criteria, we also measured the severity of IBS based on the self-reported severity of their pain and how often they had the pain, and how much it interfered with their daily life. We scored these individuals on a score of 0 to 500 about how severe their disease is. Most people had mild IBS. About half of people had that had IBS had mild IBS, and about 1/3 of them had moderate IBS. Severe IBS, really bad IBS, is rarer, but it's still a significant number. It's 11% of all the IBS cases, which means about 1 in 60 people in the population was suffering from severe IBS. And severe IBS here really is quite severe. This is people who have severe abdominal pain at least every few days, and many of them every day, which causes major interference with their general life. So these are people who are really suffering from this disease. This group is, even compared to IBS people, is predominantly female. More than 80% of people that have severe IBS were female. A bit of a word of warning with this and everything that kind of follows is that this population is, it's not a general UK it's not a general population. It's slightly biased. It's in particular biased towards people who are older. So they're mostly people, 50 or 60 or above. It's whiter, so it has less ethnic diversity than the UK as a whole, and it's also more affluent. Though interestingly, within that, the people that have IBS tend to be less affluent. So people that live in socially deprived areas tend to have higher levels of IBS. So there clearly is a relationship between social deprivation and digestive health there. So that's the IBS side of things. How about the mental health side of things? So there's sort of 2 ways that you can measure mental health in a population as a whole. One is the sort of the official recorded medical diagnoses. So these are people who are diagnosed by a doctor with major depression or generalized anxiety disorder or some recognized mental health disease. And those tend to be recorded in patients' medical records. That's one way you can get at it. Another way is you can use mental health questionnaires. So those are you actually ask the individual about their current mood at the time of sampling. So one question that we asked, or that the UK Biobank asks, is, over the last 2 weeks, how often have you not been able to stop or control worrying? This is called uncontrolled or uncontrollable worrying. And people are given multiple choice to say not at all, several days in the last 2 weeks, more than half of days, or in every day. And then we assign people a score on that here between 0 and 3, based on how often they have uncontrolled worrying. And that becomes the uncontrolled worrying score. And we generate a lot of these scores to try and understand people's mental health. And note that this person, if you worry if you have uncontrollable worrying nearly every day, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a mental health problem or mental health disease. It could just be that you're worrying because there's something in your life that's meaning you're worrying every day. So mental health and mental illness are not necessarily the same thing. In terms of the diseases, the diagnosed diseases, IBS patients are about 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder or panic attacks, and around 2.5 times more likely to be diagnosed with depression. But when you sort of start digging into these kind of surveys, that's really where you see the kind of thing that's going on with IBS patients. So we make these radar plots, which sort of summarize for a given population the burden of various different anxiety symptoms here. And so this is GAD-7, so this is 7 of these kind of things: nervousness, worrying, uncontrollability, worrying excessively. The green ring in the middle is people that are digestively healthy, so people that don't have IBS or any abdominal pain related to digestion, and they tend to have, this is sort of normal levels of anxiety for the population. But you can see as the rings get concentric, this is more and more severe IBS until you get to this red outer ring, which is very severe IBS. And you see that people that have severe IBS also have very severe anxiety issues very often, particularly around worrying, excessive worrying, trouble relaxing, uncontrollable worrying. It's very common among people with severe IBS. As well as sort of purely psychological features, there are also a number of these questions that symptoms that we refer to as sort of somatization symptoms. These are physical symptoms which tend to go hand in hand with anxiety or mental ill health. They include things like tiredness, sleep disorders, back pain, headaches, and things like that. And as well as the sort of digestive symptoms, IBS patients have a lot of these things as well, particularly around tiredness and sleeping. People who have severe IBS tend to have these other symptoms. So that's mental health in general. Genetics and IBS. So as I said, IBS is not a genetic disease. There isn't a gene for IBS. There isn't a mutation that makes you have the disease. It doesn't originate in your DNA, but it is genetically influenced and it does run in families. In our data, about 1/4 of IBS patients also have a close family member with IBS. And we know from other studies that there definitely is a genetic component to this. We say that IBS is a complex disease, a disease that has both genetic and non-genetic risk factors, and you can't assign the cause of the disease to any one thing. There's lots of different factors. And with the genetics, we're often looking at these sort of small effect variants. So I think that there's going to be, you expect to see multiple different genes or genetic variants, each of which has a small influence. If you have this particular mutation or variant in your DNA, you'll be 5%, 10% more likely to develop IBS. So if these are only small effects and they're not causing the IBS, why might we be interested in them? So there's 2 reasons we want to find IBS risk genes. One is that they can tell us about the biology of the disease. The genes make proteins make cells, or make cells work anyway. And by understanding how variants change genes, we can understand how variants change your body to put you at risk of IBS, which can allow us to understand the way the disease happens and may give us clues to allow us to help treat the disease. They can also tell us about the relationship between different diseases. If we find 2 diseases that share a lot of the same risk genes, it'll tell us about the ways in which those two diseases are related based on the genes they share. How do we study genetics of something like IBS? This used to be very difficult and only very clever people could do it. Luckily these days it's got a lot simpler, basically because the technology has improved. And so these days the process is very simple. We take our big collection, our big population, in our case the UK Biobank. We split it up into people that have the disease or don't have the disease, so our IBS cases and our digestively healthy controls. We use complicated machines we take DNA samples from people, from saliva or blood. We use DNA sequencing machines or genotyping machines to measure variable parts of the genome. We make a big long list of all these places that people vary in their DNA, that people differ from each other. And then we go variable by variable, bit by bit of the genome, and we see if those variants are more common in people that have IBS than in controls. We generate these. This is a plot that we often make in genetics, which is called a Manhattan plot. And every single dot in this graph represents one part of the DNA, one part of the genome. And the height, how far the dot is up the y-axis, is a measure of how much more common that variant is in IBS than in controls in our data set. And we call it a Manhattan plot because we have these big towers that sort of tower out above, and these are true associations. These are risk genes that are associated with IBS. And we draw this red dotted line, which represents a sort of a standard amount of evidence, a standard amount of signal we want to see, and lines that rise above this represent regions of the genome which are associated with IBS. We found 6 of them, and we've written in what the genes we think these are here. These were these were some of the first major associations with IBS, some of the first replicated associations that we think were robust. So we're kind of really happy to find these and to what they can tell us. The first thing that they did tell us is that if you look at what the genes are and you're sort of familiar with the research in this, you see that these look like brain genes. Really, they don't look like diseases of variants of the digestive system or genes of the digestive system. CADM2, one of the genes, is an anxiety risk gene. MCAM1 and FAM120A are depression risk genes. And so it really looked like the crop of things we were finding were brain-based. We did a more complicated statistical modeling where we sort of tried to ask across every disease that we had information on how strongly related was IBS to that disease. And we found that about half of the genetic risk for IBS is shared with anxiety. And if you look at the other traits, you see things like anxiety, neuroticism, which is a personality trait, depressive symptoms, insomnia, schizophrenia, bipolar. A lot of mental health things were coming up here. And we did not see particularly strong associations with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease or other kind of classic diseases of the intestine. So what's going on here, and what's driving this relationship between IBS and mental health? Why are they so correlated? And also why are the genetics of IBS and the genetics of mental health so similar? So I'm going to quickly, just to end up, go through 3 of the sort of hypotheses that we've been studying and looking at here about why there is this relationship between IBS and mental health. The first is the kind of the simplest one, which is that there are direct effects between these diseases, i.e. one disease causes the other disease. IBS, for obvious reasons, particularly severe IBS, often makes people anxious or makes them feel depressed. It often means that they have a lot to worry about, because they need to worry about going to the toilet or when they're going to have an onset of pain. And likewise, being anxious or being depressed can mess with your digestion. I think we all know that if we're very stressed, it tends to affect our digestive systems. This also comes up in some of the evidence of the way that IBS is treated. So we know that if you use antidepressants to treat someone's anxiety or depression, and that treatment is successful, then it also tends to reduce their IBS symptoms if they have them. And it also goes the other way. Treatments for IBS, even those that impact stool, so you wouldn't expect to impact the brain at all. If you successfully treat people's IBS and make their digestion better, they also tend to see a reduction in anxiety. So IBS is definitely causing anxiety symptoms, and anxiety is definitely causing IBS symptoms. And there's even a whole branch of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a type of talking therapy that is designed to treat IBS and anxiety at the same time by targeting what's called gastrointestinal specific anxiety. So the anxiety that people feel, which is related to their digestion. And if you do so, then it tends to treat both IBS and anxiety effectively. So some of the reason that IBS patients and anxiety patients are similar is just that having one disease causes the other disease. But in our data, we know that that's not the entire story. We know that there's more going on than just a direct one causing the other. One analysis that we did is we identified people in the UK BioBank who were anxious or had an anxiety disorder, but were completely digestively healthy, that we knew based on survey data had no problems with their digestion, no evidence of IBS. And we took another group, which was IBS patients, that we knew based on their medical records and their survey data that they had no symptoms of anxiety. So we had non-anxious IBS patients and digestively healthy anxious people, and those two groups of people still look genetically similar. So even if your IBS isn't causing anxiety and your anxiety isn't causing IBS, then there's still a relationship between these two diseases or these two symptoms. So a second hypothesis is that we have shared risk factors. There could be things like behavioral or environmental risk factors that put you at risk of both developing IBS and anxiety. One example of that, which comes up quite strongly in our data, is insomnia. So we already saw, based on those other plots, that people with IBS tend to have sleeping problems. And in general, IBS patients are about 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from insomnia compared to people who are digestively healthy. Insomnia is also a strong risk factor for depression and for anxiety. So sleep disorders in general tend to have depression and anxiety as outcomes. And insomnia is also a partly genetic trait. Some people are predetermined, not predetermined. Some people have a higher risk of being insomnia based on their DNA, being insomniac based on their DNA than other people. And it's possible that the genetic link between IBS and anxiety is due to a genetic link with insomnia. And there's a whole host of other shared things that could be going on here. Alcohol or substance use, changes in diet, exercise, all of which could be putting you at risk of both mental health and mental ill health and digestive ill health. And some of these are much harder to measure, so harder to study. The final thing that kind of gets the sort of people that study gastroenterology excited is this concept of the gut-brain axis. So obviously the digestive system and the brain are very different things, but there's lots of neurons in both of them, and neuronal function is important to both how the brain works and how the digestive system works. And the nervous system, the intestinal nervous system, the nerves in your intestine and your brain in your head talk to each other quite a lot. And so there is a sort of a sharing of systems between these two things. One interesting bit of evidence of that is that antidepressants are often effective for IBS, even if the patient is not depressed or anxious. So you can make IBS better by giving someone antidepressants. Sometimes it doesn't always work, but it has some efficacy, even if they're not depressed or anxious. And that's because we think that antidepressants have a direct effect on the nerves in the intestine. Antidepressants, at least most commonly used ones, tend to work by increasing serotonin in neurons, or at least they have the impact of increasing serotonin in neurons. And there's evidence that treating the neurons in the intestine with increased serotonin can help regulate muscle contractions and make IBS symptoms better. So this is a case of where the same kind of systems are in play in both the brain and the intestine. And that gives us this hypothesis that we're kind of excited about, that you could have genes that cause defects in the neurons in various subtle ways. So that they cause neurons to not quite function properly. And if those non-functioning neurons are in the brain, they may cause problems like anxiety or depression. But if those neurons are in the gut, they may cause problems such as IBS or problems with digestion. So thank you for listening, everyone. A few take-home messages that I think are things that I'd like people to take away from this. One, perhaps most important one, is that IBS is common. About 1 in 7 people will experience it at any given time. More people will experience it at some point in their life. Lots of people have undiagnosed IBS, particularly mild or even moderate IBS will often go undiagnosed. Beyond the sort of standard digestive symptoms of IBS, IBS patients also suffer from a range of other physical and particularly mental health symptoms that can contribute towards their disease. And that the risk of IBS has a weak but measurable genetic component. So genes do change your risk of developing the disease. And genetic risk factors are also strongly shared with anxiety, depression, and other mental health. And this reflects to some extent direct effects, but it also likely represents shared risk factors and also a shared gut-brain biology between digestive and mental health. I obviously want to thank the Oxford Biomedical Research Centre for inviting me to give this talk and for supporting medical research in Oxford in general. I'd like to thank our funders, including the Wellcome Trust, the Kennedy Institute of Rheumatology, and the Kennedy Trust for Rheumatology Research. And all of the people. This is a massive project. I've just pulled out some of the people that worked on this here, particularly Chris Eisbelt, who was our PhD student, or DPhil student in Oxford, who did a lot of most of the analysis that we've seen was done by done by Chris, not by me, and he's just finished his PhD and successfully defended, and he's going to be a doctor soon, and we're all very, very proud of him. And then also all the gastroenterologists and analysts that helped us on the project, and also the UK Biobank, including Joe Holliday in particular, who really helped us get the survey up and running and generate all this data that we really couldn't have generated otherwise. Thank you for that, and happy to take any questions.